Hello, everyone. We are going to be starting in about 2 minutes, waiting for a couple more people to join. Thank you. Okay. Hello, everyone. Welcome to this side event. Thank you for taking time to be with us. My name is Anabella Rosemberg. I'm an advisor on just transition for the Climate Action Network, as well as for the UN Research Institute for Social Development, UNRISD. So you are going to have the immense pleasure that I hope you share with me of having this incredible panel reflecting on our issue of the day, which is the the just and equitable phase out of fossil fuels, and how that connect to the global stocktake process, and more broadly to the conversation that we are having about energy supply here in the UNFCCC, and what does it mean for countries, for inequalities within countries, and some of the solutions that movements on the ground are also thinking to addressing that need. So as a quick intro for this conversation, you all know by now, after multiple releases, and I'm sure reading also the IPCC, the IEA, and different reports, that coal, oil, gas remain the leading source of CO2 emissions over the last decade. They are responsible for about 86% of all carbon dioxide emissions in the past decade. That their projections, unfortunately, in particular projections in terms of infrastructure buildup, it still indicates that we are going to exceed the budget, the emissions budget that we have to stay within 1.5, which, as you know, is the objective of the Paris Agreement. That all relevant agencies that work on this issue have already indicated that if we wanted to stay in a safe pathway to 1.5, fossil fuel infrastructure and new fossil fuel infrastructure should not proceed, and therefore this sends also the signal on the need of managed and organized phase out of this industry. We also know that, corporations are not doing this on their own, that governments are also driving behind them a massive permits development that would allow those companies to continue exploitation of new sources. And therefore, going strictly against not only what science, but as I was saying, a lot of different institutions in the UN system that governments themselves are part of, and basically running an agenda that is at odds with climate justice, with balance, with well-being, and the development and the capacity of many people to thrive in this planet. So I would also like to add that this scenario, and the scenario of a fossil fuel phase out and the need to manage it in a just and equitable manner, also brings another dimension, which is the more than 80 million jobs that could be affected by the transformation, not only because of the end of fossil fuels and direct jobs in the sector, but also by the different impacts that transformation could have if it's not planned with a just transition in mind. So we are going to have the possibility to discuss with colleagues coming from their different places and have hopefully an interactive conversation with you about where do we see the opportunities, the challenges, the openings for moving with a just and equitable fossil fuel phase out, and which are dimensions and principles and policies that we need to be bringing into that conversation so that we make it happen, and we make it happen fast. So without further ado, I would like to invite first Lidi Nakpil, who's the coordinator of the Asian People's Movement on Debt and Development, but is also one of the leading voices for climate justice in the Asian region, and I would say even for the global movements around the world, and everyone who's ever been in a movement in the Global South looks at Lidi for guidance and steer. So yes, I would like to ask Lidi, where is she seeing this? How is she seeing the reality of fossil fuel expansion in the Asian region, and more generally, what does she see as the connection to the Paris conversation and how we move this forward?
Yeah, I'd like to. I'm happy to share what's going on in Asia. You know, one of a region where it's part of the globe's biggest producer and consumer of fossil fuels. And there are several very key trends and developments. First, we are turning the tide on coal. I think that's true also for other regions, but especially in Asia, it's been very clear we've had important wins against the expansion of coal. Part of that is making sure that the major funders of coal in terms of international flows are now have shifted their position. Korea, China, Japan have already made commitments that they will stop funding overseas coal. There's been commitments among even private banks that they will phase down their investments in coal. We haven't won the fight, but we are turning the tide. But it comes also with another trend, and that is a big push for gas as bridge fuel. And this certainly what is happening globally in terms of the energy crisis and how the UK, Europe, and the US are pushing further gas expansion. That's also true in the Asia region. The narrative has been there even before the Russian invasion of the Ukraine, that gas is the transition fuel, so that there's now so much, it's more than doubling of gas projects in the pipeline, not literally just pipeline projects, but so many different kinds of gas projects now in the pipeline in Asia. So we hear this like a mantra, no? So the shift to low carbon energy, the way is through gas, but now there's all sorts of other technologies being pushed. So you have Japan leading on the push for hydrogen, for ammonia co-firing, for CCUS. So there's now a lot of technologies being pushed so that they're using the win against coal as reason and justification to push all these other things. So clearly we're not winning the bigger war yet. We'd also share that Asia is also the grounds for a lot of just energy transition kind of projects. So we're all familiar with the JETP, but the Asian Development Bank also has its ETM, the Energy Transition Mechanism. Several Asian countries are also targeted by the climate investment funds for their own energy transition programs, and so on. So the key issues coming out right now, of course, they're doing the usual talk about addressing communities, workers that will be displaced, and so on. But some of the key issues that are coming up right now, and we as a community have to address, is what about the bailout of fossil fuel corporations? Because that's a major element in many of these just energy transition programs. I don't know how many have heard the term quantitative easement. So that's a term in economics. It just actually means paying out the fossil fuel corporations so that they will phase down or decommission their projects. So it's from our point of view, from the point of view of people and communities, it's bailing out the fossil fuel corporations. Now, after doing so much harm, at the end of the day, you're going to pay them so that they don't lose money in the process of phasing out fossil fuels. And this is something that we need to address today, because this idea of quantitative easement, of paying off the fossil fuel companies, is also an idea very much seriously being discussed and considered by many of our partners and supporters out there. So that's one of the issues that we need to look at. And part of what makes this really bad for us is there's a lot of talk of scaling up lending or opening new lending windows for these types of support for the private sector to happen. So one of our questions is, who are they going to lend to? Are they going to lend to our governments yet again so that our governments can then bail out the fossil fuels? So a lot of things that need to be looked into regarding the financing of this so-called just transition. Also, in our region, we're also beginning to realize, especially with the push of these transition fuels, that our fight against fossil fuels to phase out also depends on how we are going to fight for the phase-in of 100% renewables. Because what will happen, for instance, the risk in Asia is, okay, we're winding down coal, but we're winding up gas. No? So unless we're ready to replace and supplant not just the pipeline projects for fossil fuels, but the actual already existing projects for a rapid phase out of existing projects, unless we're ready to supplant that with 100% with renewable technology, especially solar and wind, then one of the real concerns of our people keep coming up, which is, what do we do for energy? If we, as a community, are just talking about phasing out fossil fuels, a very natural challenge to us is, what about the energy needs of our people, which is very immediate, and in many, many cases, a matter of survival. So unless we have those answers, we're not going to get a lot of traction with many communities if we're then now, especially in Asia, the popular notion is gas is clean. So the fight against coal is huge, it's challenging, but even more the fight against gas, for instance. So unless we answer that question, then we're not going to get as far as we want to. And then just on the last point, or the last 2 points, one is, energy campaigners and movements really need to speak with louder voices on the issue of climate finance delivery. Because the energy transition in the South will not happen rapidly, and least of all equitably and justly, unless there is delivery of climate finance. The answer is not just, or not even primarily, in unlocking private finance to finance the transition, because there's a lot of issues there. And we don't have maybe enough time to go into the issues. And at the very least, we also have to understand that governments have to lead in this process, and without their own capacity and capability to lead, which includes resource capacity, then we will not have a chance for this transition to happen. So climate finance is a must. And then lastly, I just want to kind of maybe flag that we're also now into working out in very concrete ways the principles and parameters, not just transitioning out of fossils, but how we transition into renewables, because that's also not an easy process, and that will not happen naturally in a just and equitable way. So we need to look at both parts of the equation. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Lydia. A lot to think about and food for thought. I mean, including this issue of the bailing out of corporations. I mean, we want people to be bailed out when we are talking about a just and equitable transition, not the corporations. So I think it's important to see how public money is being used and deployed when we are thinking about the just transition, and the other elements about the phasing out, phasing in, and the whole climate finance delivery as a critical element as well for the transition. So we want to keep this interactive, and I guess now it's a question for you all here. Let's see if you are paying attention. I guess the challenge to the audience is how likely you see the fossil phase out in your country. Stand up if you think you are seeing this coming. Okay. No, but that's no, because now's the second question. This is the optimists on the room. I guess that now the question is, how important is for your country to phase out in an equitable and just way fossil fuels? How critical do you think it is? So, absolutely. I mean, so thank you. I think that is showing the space also of growth and mobilization in our movement. I think we all know it's needed. We all want it to happen. And at the same time, we still don't feel this is happening. So I would like to ask Alex. So we have with us Alex Rafalowicz. He's the director of the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty Initiative that I'm sure you've heard about. Alex, why? Why that gap? And what do you think are the barriers and the challenges that we are facing to achieve a fair and equitable phase out, and how to get there?
Thank you, Anabella. Thank you, everybody. I should have maybe stood up on the first question. I live in Colombia, and actually the Minister of the Environment at the COP last year said that for Colombia, the question of the transition of fossil fuels is not only an energy transition question, it's also an economic and fiscal transition question. And I think that lies at the heart of some of the barriers that many states across the world face when trying to think about how do we make a transition from fossil fuels. There is a question about energy access and about the provision of energy services, but for fossil fuel producer states, those that extract coal, oil, and gas, there's a question around how does the structure of the state continue, and how does the structure of the workforce continue as this transition happens. And I think there was research done by Carbon Tracker that suggested about 400 million people live in countries where more than a third of state revenue comes from fossil fuel rents, and where the UN would describe the Human Development Index as low. So that's 400 million people who will face a very significant stability crisis if we have an unmanaged, unplanned, rapid transition of fuel sources without international response. So I would say actually our biggest barrier to this transition on fossil fuels and this fossil fuel phase out is a lack of international attention. There's a lack of international attention, firstly, even to the accountability and transparency for the responsibility for the problem. Again, to shout out to our friends at Carbon Tracker, they've helped to build the first global registry of fossil fuel reserves. And this registry demonstrates where and how much coal, oil, and gas and its potential climate impact are placed across the world. Our hope is that this registry will go on to be a tool for further accountability for governments internationally about their actual plans around extraction. So there's an accountability to the international community question. But then there's a question around how does the international system structure itself to support governments that want to stop the extraction of fossil fuels rather than direct them to do so. Many of you will have seen comments from the minister from Ecuador commenting that their plans for further expansion and extraction of oil in the Amazon is partly driven by their need to service international debt obligations. And that's a principal driver of their policy decisions with relation to extraction. So currently, our international debt system is set up to encourage countries to extract fossil fuels. So that's a rule that we need to change. In order for a country to be able to diversify away from the extraction of fossil fuels, they'll need access to alternative economic activities and programs. And there's been very limited willingness to talk about access to the technology and resources for those types of economic diversification programs. And as Liddy was mentioning, there's also some challenges around what are our obligations to existing fossil fuel corporations and what are their obligations to us. So there's been currently within the structures of international law a focus on providing relief to corporations who lose their rights to expected profits. And this is creating a chilling effect on many states in their willingness to put prohibitions on extraction or to revoke licenses and other permits for extraction. So we need to find a way to overcome those asserted rights by corporations to take public money for their supposed harms, and find a way to make them liable to pay the costs for the true costs for their extraction and for their harm. So these are various areas of international effort and cooperation that are woefully underdeveloped. And because of that, there's been a growing movement of civil society from across the world calling for a new international governance mechanism, a fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty, which would be a way to create a norm around the need for no new fossil fuels, and then to get into a discussion about where do we currently have existing reserves, how do they need to be wound down, and then 3, what are the conditions that would allow governments to actually do so? How could we realize a just transition in a holistic sense in order to be able to realize that? And I think concerningly for anybody who was just in the Just Transition Working Group, informal, or whatever status it had, you'll see that there is a real lack of willingness by some of the countries that have contributed the most to the climate problem to even want to talk about the need for international cooperation on just transition. And so that's why several countries across the world, thousands of people, or hundreds and thousands of people, there are 80 cities across the world as well, have called for a fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty, a new instrument to try and help have these conversations in a much more constructive way and to create much clearer direction and standards about how the international system wants to support the transition from fossil fuel extraction. I think.
Thanks, Alex. And yes, I mean, you didn't even mention like the geeky ISDS reference. I don't know how you succeeded on that. You know, all these the international mechanism by which the corporations just sue states if they were to go with the idea of what their people are asking for. And we've seen already several countries being sued. And there's certainly a huge, risk for many countries if they were to change their pathway on how corporations are going to turn to them. And then create even more risks for some of these progressives and governments out there in trying to pursue a different pathway. Nathan, we are about to watch 2 very short videos that we wanted to share with the audience, a couple of more contributions. Go for it.
We are in a climate emergency. We need to get off of fossil fuels fast.
Fossil fuels not only drive climate change when we burn them, oil and gas as feedstocks in plastics, fertilizers and other petrochemicals accelerate a triple crisis of climate, biodiversity and toxic pollution.
The climate crisis caused by fossil fuels has disproportionate gendered impacts and exacerbates further existing conflict and instability. We urgently need a fossil fuel treaty as fossil fuels exacerbate conflict across the globe.
A fossil fuel treaty based on justice, human rights and ecology can help prevent dangerous distractions and speculative techno-fixes to allow space for the implementation of real solutions.
3 principles underscoring that treaty for me should be community consultation, decolonizing the financial system, and human rights and gender equality.
Conflict and insecurity, as well as environmental destruction due to mining, have disproportionate gendered impacts, which is another reason why affected and diverse communities must be included in the development and implementation of this treaty so that a just transition is conflict sensitive and gender responsive.
Y creemos que debemos empezar a debatir nuevos principios que permitan a los países que venimos desde el hemisferio sur poder proponer un tratado, poder poner principios que se basen en los contextos y dinámicas propias de comunidades, pueblos indígenas, comunidades campesinas, estudiantes, comunidades de fe, pero que responda eso también a las características propias de los países del hemisferio sur o del sur global.
And I believe that this is time for humanity to come together as one and say enough is enough. We need to start continuing preserving carbon sinks like the Okavango Delta. And that is why it is important for all of us to come together and sign on to the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty so we can protect these biodiversity hotspots for all of us, not only for me, not only for the communities in Kavango, but for all of us.
Bom, eu sou o cacique Edmilson, do povo Caripuna, o atual coordenador do CCPIL, Conselho de Cacique dos Povos Indígenas aqui de Oiapoque. Bom, para nós, povos indígenas aqui de Oiapoque, somos 4 povos, Caripuna, Galibi-Maruorno, Palicus, Galibi-Calinãs. Bom, para nós, a preocupação com a exploração de petróleo aqui na costa do Amapá é muito grande, porque a gente não concorda com o estudo da Petrobras, dizendo que a terra indígena ela está fora de qualquer impacto. Então, isso não é verdade. A gente sabe que a terra indígena diretamente já está sendo impactada, né, com essa ação da Petrobras. O fluxo de pessoas está aumentando no município de Oiapoque. A terra indígena, o Açá, Galibi, Juminã, é uma terra indígena que fica muito próxima ao município de Oiapoque, e a gente sabe que vamos sofrer os impactos, e os nossos rios que são banhados com água de marés, a gente com certeza, se houver um acidente, um vazamento lá fora, vamos ser diretamente atingidos, sim. Nós, povos indígenas, exigimos que seja feita a consulta com os povos indígenas. Não somos contra, mas nós exigimos os nossos direitos, né, em relação a isso.
Thank you, Nathan. I think for the ones that are not Portuguese speakers, I mean, maybe just a word I mean, like just to say that what it was explained here was I mean, and Fernanda will correct me. I mean, she's the actual real Portuguese speaker, but I mean, was first the like disagreement of the community. I mean, with a series of studies of impacts from Petrobras. I mean, in their community about the impact of exploration close to them, and the belief and the certainty that they would going to suffer the impacts of that exploration and exploitation in their communities, in the rivers, I mean, that are connected, I mean, to the places in which they are, and the fact that they are not necessarily against everything, but they want the rights respected, and they are not seeing this coming through. Yeah. Fernanda, did I miss anything on that?
No, that was really good. I think that the video is about something that's going on in Brazil. I'm not sure you heard about, but Petrobras was asking for a license to drill, to research oil and eventually drill it at the mouth of the Amazon River. So that would generate various impacts that we don't know of and impact indigenous communities. It was just an illustration of the social and also the environmental impacts of fossil fuel exploration, which is what I'm going to talk about soon.
Exactly. This gives me a very good segue into you, Fernanda Carvalho, the Global Climate Policy Lead in WWF, originally from Brazil, still living in Brazil.
Yes.
And yes, I mean, like, you can roll. Now you are in the topic, Fernanda. I mean...
Yeah, it's a pleasure to be here today with such a great panel. It gives me a lot of honor, and it's great to see a almost full house here while the plenary is going on. So I think that it's great that's great to start, and I think my job is now much easier because colleagues have already made it much clear that there is no space for new fossil fuel and exploitation, and current exploitation needs to be phased out if we want to stay on a 1.5 pathway. Science is saying this, and everybody that's worked on it agrees. And as you saw from the video, unfortunately you didn't hear, fossil fuel impacts, I think that, phasing out fossil fuels, it's the biggest contribution of the climate regime to societies, to people, and also to nature. I think that fossil fuels exploitation and exploration affects health, affects jobs, affects the quality of life of people, and it's also a matter of distributive justice. For example, in the Amazon, this project that we heard about, we would generate benefits for a very small group while socializing impacts. And we have seen that before with another project that is not on fossil fuels, but that's hydropower energy. So they say we need energy for development, but this project is based in the state in Brazil that has the least access to energy. So distributive justice is important also in this context. 3.3 billion to 3.6 billion of people are already vulnerable to the impact of climate change. The IPCC has said that. And climate change is also the third driver of biodiversity loss. The IPBES, that is the IPCC similar to the Biodiversity Convention, they mentioned this. So that's also a contribution to nature and biodiversity. So in WWF, we talk about a just energy transformation. And what is a just energy transformation? We don't want to just throw another concept or another acronym out there, but that's how we recognize there is no single just transition. Just transitions are many. Every country has a different pathway. Every sector has a different pathway. And local communities as well. So there are various transitions there under a just energy transformation that for us has 4 features. The first feature is access to affordable, reliable, sustainable, and modern energy for all. So it's basically implementing SDG, the Sustainable Development Goal 7, of clean and affordable energy for all. We have 675 million people without access to energy, and this is just unacceptable. We want to tackle existing systemic injustices as well as avoiding creating new ones. As I already mentioned, we want to align efforts to limit global warming to 1.5 with halting and reversing the biodiversity loss by 2030. We think biodiversity is also fundamental for people to thrive, so you cannot just look at one side of that coin. The coin has 2 sides. We also want that all people impacted have equal and fair access to justice, and I already mentioned distributive justice. They need to have access to decision-making and information, and also we want to protect environmental defenders and indigenous peoples. So how can we make that happen? And I bring us back to the context of the discussions in the UNFCCC. We heard about the fight in Asia, of which Lydie is very much at the forefront. We heard about this fantastic initiative that is the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty, and we want a global plan to phase out. I think that that's an aspiration of civil society as a whole, to have this global plan to phase out fossil fuels while scaling up renewables, energy access, and also energy efficiency, and it's never enough to repeat again and again that all those things need to happen simultaneously. We are talking about phasing out fossil fuels while scaling up renewables to replace fossil fuels in the energy matrix. We are not adding just energy that's renewable to the matrix. So that's really important. And this, in the UNFCCC, we envisage a package, and the elements of the package, I have to look here because I have a mind map. So in this big package that we envisage, the building blocks are the cover text. The cover text, the political decision that comes out of every COP. And we want an acknowledgement there that we need to phase all fossil fuels. And it's not phasing out emissions. You know, the easiest way to phase out fossil fuel emissions is to phase out fossil fuels. We cannot rely on unproven technologies that are dangerous distractions at this moment when we need to reduce emissions by 43% in relation to 2019 levels by 2030. The second piece of it is the GST, and the title of this event is how we need the GST to deliver on that. And I think the GST has to make strong recommendations for the NDCs to include policies, measures, and timetables for phasing out fossil fuels. That's a key message that should come out of the GST. We have the mitigation work program that, you know, can take those messages to a more granular and actionable level, recommending, those targets that we want for renewables and for energy efficiency, the investment in grids and the right storage, reducing the cost of capital, and also, as I mentioned again, making the case that Colombia has made very clearly in the dialogues that we participated, that fossil fuels, they need to be phased out, while renewables are scaled up. Those things are not separate. And we also need to find the money to support the countries that are on this trajectory, because as we mentioned here, there's money to bail out fossil fuel corporations, but what about the countries that are developing countries that are pledging to phase out fossil fuels? They need to be supported on this trajectory. We, of course, the Just Transition Work Program is the core of delivering on governance, social measures, social nets, international cooperation, and supporting equity and energy access. There's also a role for, of course, 2.1c on the risking the investment in renewables, ending and redirecting subsidies, and of course the technology mechanism when we talk about international cooperation for technology transfer and international property rights, intellectual property rights waivers and transfer of technology in more favorable terms for developing countries. It's a lot? Yeah, it's a lot. If it was easy, we would be already there, but we now need to align forces and make all those pieces work together, and not only at COP. I think, there's the Gs, there is the fights of the people on the ground, there is the initiative of the treaty. Let's turn the tide.
Thank you very much, Fernanda. This is very inspiring. And so if you cross the president of the COP, you know where to send him with all the list of...
I'm sending it right now.
Yes. No, but thank you. And I think it was also very important to also go back to the connection between this idea and why it is so important that it gets recognized in the context of the UNFCCC with its principles. Because one of the things that we know is that the transition will happen. It will happen. The issue is whether it's going to be just and it's going to be equitable, because that is a decision. That's a political decision. And I wonder, before we move into Geneviève, so that you stay connected with this panel, maybe asking you, like a couple of you in the audience, like what's the difference? What adds just an equitable phase out to phase out? Like when you're thinking about what is just and equitable. What is the difference between a just and equitable phase out, a simple phase out of fossil fuels? What comes to your mind? Just one or two of you. Don't be shy. Anyone? What inspires you when you're saying just and equitable? Please, sister, go for it.
Is this on? Can you guys hear me?
No.
I think you need to turn it on.
Oh, can you hear me now? Okay, great. I would think that making sure that UNDRIP is something that is recognized and enacted in countries' policies all throughout the world, because the U.S., which is where I'm from, definitely doesn't. And so there's a huge worry of land grabbing, not just in the U.S., but throughout the whole world, if a transition was to be done in an unjust way.
Thank you. Thank you, and thank you for breaking the ice. Is there anyone that wants to say something about what does just and equitable be? Please.
So for me, I think I like equitable more, because it means that we understand where are people coming from, what sort of heritage, history, needs, and just giving everyone the same in a way. So when I try to think about both, I'm more intentional toward equitable. In that sense, if I speak about communities, at least within the Middle East and North Africa as regions that I come from, I would say that workers are considered in this transition, and also the economy, the technology, the energy in different communities that don't have access to energy, the education, the gender, elements that's also related to this. So when I think about transition, all of those factors need to be considered, and the countries in general, in terms of South, and even countries in terms of the region, they are not homogeneous. They are people inside, they have differences, different privileges, and all of this, and this need to be considered. So yeah, this was...
Thanks so much. And yes, there are different features of justice and different ways in which this takes shape in countries, and we definitely need that inspiration also of how things have happened in the past. I mean, and basically to the contrary, because I've never come across a single worker, trade unionist, or community that has gone through a transition and say, oh, this was great. So I think we have still a lot to learn and do as well, and really bring, this opportunity of absolutely transforming the energy sector, but also transforming the way in which the extractive system has organized itself, and do it in an absolutely different way into the future. Geneviève, I would like to invite you now to join the conversation. Geneviève Jiva is the Principal International Relations Officer in the Office of the Prime Minister of Fiji. So Fiji actually convened already a conversation about ambition and how you bring parties into a forward-looking exercise, and also, most important, taking stock about what didn't happen in the past. And that's the most tricky element of the whole GST exercise, when you see a lot of parties trying to avoid looking back at their responsibility. So when you think about that moment, what do you think would be interesting lessons for what we are observing here in the GST, and moving, from there into actionable recommendations for the enhancement of NDCs?
Thank you, Anabella, and thank you to my fellow panelists. I'm very happy to be here and contribute to the discussions. I guess I want to start by saying that Pacific leadership and Fiji's leadership on this issue is not new, and it's certainly not something that we want less ambition on. We have very clear climate targets that point towards a renewable energy future and a sustainable future for all. Fiji's current nationally determined contribution aims to reduce 30% of our GHG emissions by 2030, with a focus in the energy and electricity sector. But currently, 40% of our electricity is still sourced from fossil fuels. And so Fiji is now also venturing into identifying alternative renewable energy sources to try and bridge this gap. And we hope that the rest of the world can come along with us in a safe and just transition. The challenges that we face can't be faced by our countries alone. And that's why we believe in working together in regional and international spaces. And we need to have dialogue, and we need to be able to discuss what is happening in our countries and how we can work through solutions together. So one of these dialogues that happened earlier this year was which led to the Port Vila call for a just transition to a fossil fuel-free Pacific. And this call that I have here and I carry around with me outlines the ways that the Pacific is leading on this issue and how we can work together to make it a reality. And Fiji very strongly reiterates our support for the Port Vila call and our commitment towards a sustainable future and just transition. Ultimately, these are not new calls. We've acknowledged for years that fossil fuels are not working and that change needs to happen. In 2015, as we prepared for the Paris COP, Fiji hosted a summit which resulted in the Suva Declaration, a declaration that called for, among other things, a new global dialogue on the implementation of an international moratorium on development and expansion of fossil fuel extracting industries. And our new government has also put our support behind this. Our priorities include the promotion of renewable energy and non-fossil fuel technology options. Our Climate Change Act, which was passed in 2021, establishes a legal basis to support Fiji's sustainable development objectives, long-term climate ambition, net zero emissions targets, and a commitment to protecting Fiji's environment. We also earlier this year had a national economic summit, which brought together over 500 participants from government, private sector, civil society, and academia to discuss thematic areas of development. And one of those was energy. And the outcomes from that included a call for government to address issues of electricity supply and work towards public-private partnerships, renewable and climate-resilient energy sources. So we are fully committed to supporting outcomes that ensure the survival of our people. So you mentioned the Talanoa Dialogue that Fiji convened as the COP president in 2017. That dialogue focused on 3 questions, which: where are we, where do we need to go, and how do we get there? And it's been 6 years now, but I think the answers remain the same. We are in a situation where impacts are getting more intense and frequent, and we need to implement plans and policies that will stay within the 1.5 degree temperature goal. We get there through a safe and just transition away from fossil fuels. And in terms of the lessons that we can apply to the GST now, the Fiji presidency, along with the Talanoa Dialogue and the outcomes, released what was called the Talanoa Call to Action, which had 5 key messages that I think are incredibly relevant to this process today. Those messages included that we must fulfill the goals of the Paris Agreement. We must achieve a just transition towards a better world. We must unlock the full potential of technology. We must demonstrate bold leadership, and we must act together. And I think that is incredibly important because we can only do this if we do it together. In addition, I guess one of the main things that I wanted to say is that we cannot afford to delay action any longer. Our climate is radically changing, and with it, our ecosystems, our livelihoods, and our cultures all come under increasing threat. We are facing more and more loss and damage, and the time for bold, ambitious, and transformative action is now. Fiji fully supports the Port Vila call as an avenue to meet our climate ambition targets, and we will continue our role as climate champions nationally, regionally, and internationally, and we ask that the rest of the world joins us in this. Thank you.
Thank you, Genevieve. Thanks also for the inspiration and the optimism. In particular, in the capacity of different interests coming together and trying to figure out a way forward, which is probably something that is missing a little bit these days when you look at the atmosphere in some of those rooms. Nathan has another video to share with us.
Mr. President, I believe climate change remains the greatest moral challenge of our time. The irony is it is the poorest and the smallest countries with the least contribution of greenhouse gases which are paying the ultimate price.
We look at our children and wonder how they will know themselves or their culture should we lose our islands.
Our challenge to the international community is to take bold measures to reduce emission of all greenhouse gases to level that ensure a viable and meaningful future for states like Tonga.
The United Nations cannot and must not allow the biggest greenhouse gas emitters to turn away from their moral duty and responsibility to actually reduce greenhouse gas emissions.
Those who have contributed to this crisis the least suffer the most, physically, existentially, and ecologically. This is an injustice that must end.
This is a very special unifying moment. In adopting the Paris Agreement, all 196 countries in this room have joined the High Ambition Coalition.
My fellow political leaders, our response to climate change should never depend on whether our domestic response to climate change would get us re-elected in the next elections.
Vanuatu has heard the strong call and expectation from grassroots youth movements and indeed over 1,500 civil society organizations from around the world to draft a forward-looking, indeed intergenerational question.
Pacific youth have rallied behind the cry, "We are not drowning, we are fighting."
Over the past 3 days, Pacific leaders came together here in Port Vila, Vanuatu, in the aftermath of 2 Category 4 cyclones and a nationwide state of emergency to address the cause of the climate crisis, fossil fuels. Building on the legacy of the Pacific's leadership and standing on the shoulders of giants, ministers met over the 3 days to determine the region's pathway towards forging a fossil fuel-free future. With climate change wreaking havoc all over the Pacific and communities grappling with the impacts of extreme weather and the prospect of losing their homes, leaders came to Vanuatu with one goal: to inspire the world once again to take concrete action and ensure we meet the aims of the Paris Agreement, limiting warming to 1.5 degrees by immediately phasing out fossil fuels through a just transition. And on the final day, a historic decision was reached, with Pacific ministers unanimously calling for the creation of a fossil fuel-free Pacific, committing to spearheading the pathway towards a global, just, and equitable transition away from coal, oil, and gas. Niue, the Kingdom of Tonga, Solomon Islands, and Fiji joining Tuvalu and Vanuatu in calling for a fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty. I'm so proud to be part of this historical moment where the Pacific once again shows what true climate leadership looks like. And I hope that more countries join this voyage towards a fossil fuel-free future.
What a lovely video. I mean, and I guess the first thing that this generates on me is that, of course, there is hope, but there was this union leader a long time ago that said that we have to mourn the fight for the living, but let's take a minute. Thank you. In moments of hectic spaces like the one in which we are, we need to keep connected to the reasons why we're doing this. And we've heard a lot of solutions. We've heard a lot of hope. We heard a lot of fight. And I guess now it's also like to turn back to you. I mean, to ask you what this conversation is inspiring you. What do you think, I mean, international cooperation in this context, I mean, could look like? We are seeing people in the Global South impacted, massively impacted by the impact of the climate crisis. We're also seeing it in the Global North, the poorest and most vulnerable as well. I mean, like losing, I mean, property, life, others. And this is a space of solidarity. This is a space of global cooperation. So how we turn all these ideas into reality? What questions do you have about what we are not doing probably enough? Which ideas do you have for us to get better and move with this idea forward? So now it's up to you. Questions, reflections, thoughts, and also questions for the panel, please.
Thank you. Yeah, hi, thanks for the discussion. I'm Tim Stickings, I'm a journalist from London, and I just want to ask the panel what you think is realistic for the GST and COP28. You've all said, obviously, what you'd like to happen in the ideal world, but when they get handed the GST at COP28? What do you think is then a realistic outcome?
Thank you very much. We are probably going to pick a few questions, and then we can distribute it in the panel.
Thank you, Vanny Walkerly, journalist from Malta. I read somewhere that you have 650 MPs who have supported your proposal. But how many serious debates have there been within parliaments where parliamentarians actually ask their governments to sign this treaty?
Yeah, just to Alex, to know that at least in Brazil, we have near $25 billion a year to incentivize the fossil fuel sector. That's something that we need to count when we are saying about justice and climate justice. Thank you.
Could you tell us your name? Your name?
Alex.
Alex. Okay. Thank you. I thought it was for Alex. Sorry. Thank you very much.
Hello, my name is Jordan with Indigenous Environmental Network. And so my question is related to, which I know everybody on this panel has already been thinking about, which is why I'm asking. So it was mentioned to transition to renewable energy, to not just add more energy into the energy matrix, but to replace fossil fuels. So my question is, how will, what is the plan for protection of indigenous peoples who are vulnerable to extraction? Is reducing energy demand part of that plan, which would include, for example, the United States, military activity, things like that?
Thank you very much, Jordan. I see no immediate hand, so probably we can go for a first round of reactions, and we will have time for a second one. Fernanda, do you want to reflect on the GST, maybe the GST outcomes for COP? Or, well, maybe everyone, let's go for anarchy. I mean, like, you can all respond to
I think that you know, there's two of the questions I can try to respond to. I think the GST, I mean, we are all thinking about a course correction because we know we are not on a path to 1.5, and we have two elephants in the room. One is ambition. The targets are not going to get us to where we need to be. And the other is implementation. We don't have the right targets, but even the wrong targets are not being implemented. So we need those two things to be moving. And we want the GST. We know that this is a moment for countries to send a strong political signal that, you know, in my view, I think that, you know, countries should be called to review their 2030 targets when they table their new NDCs in 2025, and not only think about their 2035 targets. Of course, they need to think about those too. And the IPCC said that we need a reduction of 60% of emissions in 2035. And I want a strong call. I would like to see a strong call for countries to consider, you know, phasing out fossil fuels. And as you mentioned, you know, scaling up renewables to substitute fossil fuels in the energy matrix. So I think those strong political signals could be in the recommendations from the GST. So there's a high expectation from WWF on that. And we have been working hard to get those into the GST. When you mention also, you know, how do we do that? How do we replace the fossil fuels in the energy matrix? We also have a focus on energy efficiency. The G7 mentioned energy efficiency as kind of a low-hanging fruit. The IEA has said that we could go for a target of 4% of energy efficiency, and that also makes us think about, you know, the energy demand and all that. And I think that's a key component of this broader plan to phase out fossil fuels. So over to my colleagues.
Thank you, Fernanda. Lidi, I mean, thoughts in particular, I'm thinking about the issue of reducing demand, in particular in the north, the conversation about the fiscal impact also of moving out from fossil fuels, as was raised by Brazil.
Well, maybe just a very quick reaction to the question about what can we realistically expect. We're not realistic. We're working very hard to make sure that what we actually get in the end is not what is realistic now, where we are at the moment. We're wanting to change things so that what is possible can actually also be realistic. So otherwise, it's going to be very discouraging if we just look at it in terms of the here and now, no? We know what it's been like the last few years. There's so many major demands, and governments always fail us, or many of them. On the plan for the protection of the indigenous peoples. You know, right now we're currently in a process of, as I mentioned, developing principles and parameters about the just transition. And one of the key things that is very real in terms of building 100% renewable energy systems to replace fossil fuels is that there's going to be a lot of mining and extraction. Now, there are critical minerals involved in renewable energy systems, and currently, most, in fact, of these minerals are in the south and a lot in the ancestral domains of indigenous peoples. And we need to make sure that the extractivist relationships that exist in fossil fuel extraction is not going to be simply repeated in the extraction of critical minerals for renewable energy. And so it's the call for building and developing renewable energy can't simply just be that. There has to be a lot of major considerations of how it can be equitably and justly done. Yeah. And so there's a number of things that are not new. So for instance, the principle of free, prior, and informed consent, that is already internationally recognized as part of the rights of indigenous peoples. We believe it should also be recognized as part of the rights of all affected communities for any kind of projects. And that should be kind of like a bottom line that cannot be, subverted. But there's many, I'm sure you know, a host of things that we really need to safeguard. So it's not a very easy process. Our initial discussion paper on what could be a rapid, equitable, and just transition to renewables is already 35 pages and counting. Because and we didn't even go into a lot of the details, but so many important details. So we'd like to share that with you to generate more information and so on. But yes, we really need to make sure these details are there because it's not a magic bullet, just transitioning out of fossil fuels and into renewable energy. The question about the energy, how do we reduce energy consumption? And we came across, in the process of preparing this paper, we came across a very good document that the Friends of the Earth International put out, and this is a paradigm-changing proposition because the document is saying that it's not just about efficiency. We need to replace this paradigm with sufficiency. What is sufficient for, dignified, decent human lives? Because what we're seeing in many places, it's wasting. It's a huge waste of energy. And it's the notion of what is enough is so elastic. What is enough in the north is not the same as what is enough in the south. And many, in fact, I would encounter a lot of double standards. Like, this is what is enough in the north. And when they're looking at the south, what is enough they think for us is so much lower than what they think is enough in the north. Yeah. Right? So across classes, across countries, so we really need to change this paradigm. What is really sufficient to have a good life, a just and decent life? So there's so many things that we should be giving up because they don't have much to do with having a meaningful life, right? So this changes in our way of thinking. It's not just about energy efficiency, it's about thinking about what is energy sufficiency. Mm-hmm. And then, members of parliament supporting international cooperation for a fossil fuel-free future to make a push in their parliaments. We really need to make sure that, all this support is going to transform into very active involvement, and that's what we're working on. Thank you.
Thank you, Lydie. I don't know, Alex. I mean, I could go to Genevieve maybe to ask her. I mean, like, what does this? I mean, how does this effort that you are making, that we were showing in the video, I mean, like, that is bringing Pacific leaders and your country, I mean, into this fossil-free future? I mean, how are you seeing these initiatives completing each other? How do you see this treaty helping you move forward? Any reflection on how all these different initiatives that we are observing are helping you, again, in the spirit of international cooperation and in the context in which we are?
Thank you, Anabella. I think how they're helping, well, they're not quite helping yet because we're not where we need to be. But I do think that it's important that we've gotten the conversation started, that we're showing real commitment and leadership towards the future that we need. So part of the Port Vila call also speaks to the importance of starting discussions on a treaty, and our Pacific leaders, a number of Pacific leaders have supported and endorsed that. And so we think it's important that we start talking about it. And it is hard work. It is going to take time. It's certainly not, like Lida said, a magic bullet, but we have to start.
Thank you. And Alex, any thoughts? I mean, when you were talking earlier, and I think this was reflecting also on what the your same name, Alex, was referring to. I mean, like you said, well, this is not just an energy conversation. This is also a fiscal space conversation. This is also, in particular, for countries that export fossil fuels. It's not just about energy access. This is also about, budgetary balance, access to currency, and how you feel your budget at the state level. I mean, and today this is coming from extractives. So, and it's not only fossil. I mean, this is also applying to soy exports and different commodities in markets. So there is a push for exports and currency.
Yeah, I think this idea of starting conversation is really resonant. That's part of the purpose of our campaign, has been to start the conversation. So that conversation has started in different parliaments with different parliamentarians. It started in the Pacific region. It's starting in different places, and we hope that it will start also in the Global Stocktake. That the outcome of the Global Stocktake will recognize the need to consider fossil fuel production plans, will recognize the need to consider the historical responsibility for those, and a fair way of dividing up the effort to shut that down going forward. Because I think when we talk about the fiscal space and the fiscal impact of the transition, one of the biggest drivers when we think about why we have an economy still based on fossil fuels is the concept of lock-in. Now, lock-in is not only an economic concept. It's not only the fact that once we've spent billions of dollars to build the piece of infrastructure, we feel like we have to use it. It's also the lock-in of our political systems. So again, to give you the example of Colombia, the government said, we want to explore a policy that says no new contracts will be approved for exploration for oil and gas. And members of the right-wing parties in the country said, no, the purpose of the Ministry of Mines is to approve new contracts for the exploration of oil and gas. So they can't not, right? That's not their purpose. And so there's a political systems lock-in. Our political systems, regulatory systems are all locked into fossil fuels and allowing new fossil fuels. And our financial systems are locked into financing fossil fuel products, returns from fossil fuel products, loans for fossil fuel products. And in many places, our culture is locked into being part of an extractive community, being based on the extraction that comes here. And so we actually have to change that lock-in on multiple levels. And that is a transformation that is going to take time, and that is going to take effort, and is going to take many different conversations being started. And so part of the reason for our campaign is precisely that, is to say, solely focusing on this question of fossil fuels as if it is simply a technical one, if it is simply we can just replace an energy source with another source, is not actually going to confront the systemic challenge that we face head on. Thank you.
Thank you, Alex. So we have 5 more minutes, so we can take 1 or 2 very brief questions, and then I would like to allow the panel just to bring any final thoughts about how we move forward with this conversation. Yes, please. Nathan, I mean, do they have the mic there? Where is the mic? I don't know where it is, otherwise I would help you. Okay, there.
Hi, my name is Titi Suntoro from Aksi, Indonesia. So Indonesia is one of the biggest exporter of coal to Europe. And in December 2022, Indonesia reached a peak to sell about 6.6 million tons of coal to Europe, including Germany, Netherlands, Greece, and so on. So we see the hypocrisy and the double standard here. On one hand, the coal trading are still intact and then increase. And on the other hand, the governments, our government is also pushed to phase out of the coal and go to renewable, which is also on the other hand, still fake solutions that also add the problems of people affected by climate change, because there is a land grabbing, resource grabbing, and so on. So what do you think to see that the whole coal trading is still intact?
Thank you, Titi. Thanks for bringing us to also the reality of hypocrisy and how how the coal is not fully dead yet, like is not. So I see no further questions. So probably folks can reflect on this comment and this situation as well as part of their concluding remarks. And yeah, go, Titi.
Yeah. So Titi got me started on hypocrisy. There's a lot of hypocrisies here because the main trading partners of Indonesia for its coal are also in the Powering Past Coal Alliance and making pronouncements that they are ending coal in their countries, but they're importing coal from other countries, from our countries, right? Or even the US, the UK, and the EU calling out, the presidency of COP28, the UAE, for its being an oil and gas producing nation, which of course we're all concerned about. That's not my point, but my point is being that these very governments and countries have exploited oil and gas in the Arab region for decades. And all of that exploitation of oil and gas in the Arab region are still here in our atmosphere, and yet they don't talk about it. And in the meantime, on the other hand, they make pronouncements about expanding gas production for the UK, for Europe, and the US. So there is a lot of hypocrisy, and we really need to be very mindful that our own advocacies here are not used in some geopolitical dynamics when northern governments are pushing the southern governments, developing countries, to do a lot more than even the northern governments are willing to do themselves, right? And then we end up becoming, our governments and countries end up becoming the so-called obstructionists to the energy transition. So there's now talk about COP28 being the COP where there's going to be very clear targets on renewable energy, but that's good. But on the other hand, if there's no clear delivery and commitments to the delivery of climate finance, what renewable energy targets are we talking about for the South? How is that going to happen? When we're also paying for loss and damage, for adaptation, and there's a lot of hypocrisy in this so-called delivery of climate finance when 70% of what has been, the little that has been delivered is in the form of loans. So yeah, so Don't get me started on hypocrisy.
So you know, when you're going to get a good speech from Lydie, you just say hypocrisy. We just have 1 minute, and I'm a little bit scared about people starting to leave as well. So maybe we can just go in this direction and offer your final thoughts. Go, Geneviève.
Thank you. I guess part of my final thoughts is that we know that the science is clear. We know what we need to do. And while we are here, our peoples and communities are experiencing disproportionate impacts. It is a lived reality that we face Category 5 tropical cyclones and communities that have already been relocated and are being relocated, flooding and drought. And that it's becoming increasingly clear that time is running out, but that doesn't mean that there isn't hope. There is still hope, and that is why we do the work that we do. And that is why we're part of things like the Port Vila Call for Just Transition to a Fossil Fuel-Free Pacific. And we want to join our Pacific neighbors, and we want to join the world in starting a discussion, a constructive dialogue of a fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty to ensure that we meet the goals established in the Paris Agreement. That is why we are here.
Thank you very much, Geneviève. Fernanda.
Yeah, I just wanted to reflect on 2 brief points here. Yeah, the first one is the point on hypocrisy. I don't think I could be as eloquent as Lydie, but I agree very much that, we need to work on the demand. If there is, a market for fossil fuels, etc., it's because there is the demand. And the demand comes also from the north. So a just transition to me is also a fair and funded and fast fossil fuel transition. So we need to think about that. Yeah, that's true. And the second point that I wanted to reinforce Alex's point that, it's not a transition that's easy. Just say, well, let's scale up renewables and reduce our demand and consumption on fossil fuels. We really need a societal change. I come from a country and a region where, the oil companies are government-owned, and they are the pride of government. So there are developing countries, too, that are looking at filling this void when the transition starts, and some countries phase out. So we need the whole society to be thinking about this. And, yeah, it's a huge transformation that we need.
Thank you. I actually am just going to really recognize what Jen has said. Obviously, Fiji joined the Port Vila call, but I think this is the strongest and most public call from Fiji to start this conversation. And so you've all managed to witness a little bit of history, which is very exciting. And we encourage you to join us in this conversation. We do have some materials about possible principles that could underpin a fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty, which folks will have at the reception for you to check out as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Alex. And yes, you've been patient and generous with your time coming to see this panel. I guess maybe the last word on my end, if there's something that I think is important that we keep with us while we are getting through that door, is that justice and equity it doesn't imply a delay. It's an enabler for ambition. And I think that is what we really need to keep with us, because sometimes we hear, rights for communities, human rights, labor rights, gender rights, very nice, your things, but you are overloading the process. Or when we are talking about a phase out or even renewable energies, we are going to be told that all these justice elements are a little bit of an add-on, where actually they are the heart of the ambition. We need people with us. We need people to believe that this is a transition that is going to take us to a new space, a more beautiful world, to well-being, to happiness, hopefully one day for many billions of people out there. So yes, we have a pathway, we have a vision, and now we need to work. And in the meantime, we can have a drink, connect together as human beings.
I think we have allies too,
exactly.
All the ones here.
We can connect as human beings as we continue in this fight. So thank you very much.
Thank you. you. It's like if you want to make it fast, it has to be fair.
Yeah, I mean, that's it. The other way doesn't exist.
Yeah,
It's a myth.
yeah, exactly.
Like that you can make it fast. How do you want to handle the chair? You have
I can walk to the chair and then they will come and get me. It's okay. There's Charlie.